Hello and welcome to our first lecture of this course, Prehistoric Human Migrations, the story of human migrations to the quote-unquote New World. This is the first lecture in our class, and it is a lecture that is designed to help you understand the origins of human societies and cultures, and ultimately the human civilizations that we find in North and South America. Before we get into that story, I think it might be helpful to frame some of the terminology on this opening slide in the title of the lecture, because of course, some of these terms might be unfamiliar to you. They might be new to you. They might just be words that you're not really sure what they mean or what they reference. And so that we're all on the same page in understanding these terminologies precisely as scholars understand them, let's break them down. So let's begin with prehistoric. What does the word prehistoric, what does the term prehistory refer to? Well, with respect to the term history, typically, unless we add the adjective like geologic history, biological history, astronomical history, or something like that, unless we add an adjective to it, whenever we're talking about history, we're largely talking about human history, right? The actions, the societies, the cultures, the civilizations of humans. And that then limits us to a very small fraction of the geologic time on this planet. So what does it mean to be prehistory or before history? Well, history itself is a discipline dependent upon writing. Let me say that again. History is a discipline dependent and contingent upon writing. That doesn't mean the historians don't use other kinds of information to construct the past. We do. We use archaeological artifacts, the kinds of goods that people create. We use art. We use tools. We use analysis of landscapes that have been changed and transformed by human economic activity or human just habitation, if you will. We use all those things. But at its core, history is a discipline contingent upon writing, looking at the written record, looking at the writing produced from any time period in order to understand that time period better. We call those writings from the time period primary sources. You'll hear me talk a lot about primary sources in this course. You will be reading primary sources in this course as part of understanding what it means to be a historian and to learn the discipline of history in addition to the historical information that I'm going to be presenting in this class. So history is a discipline contingent upon writing. So prehistory means constructing the human past before writing was available. Now, writing develops at different time periods in different places around the world. And with respect to North and South America, which is what we're going to be talking about in this class, writing develops much later and only in a handful of places, like in Mesoamerica. So think Mexico and Central America. And in the Andes, some of those civilizations had a somewhat writing system for recording information, but that's it. So we have this issue that writing develops very, very late in a lot of places in the Americas. So what we might call prehistory is longer here than it is in other places. And there are a variety of reasons for that, some of which we might talk about in subsequent lectures. So prehistory is reconstructing the past without the benefit of writing, before writing. So prehistoric human migrations tells you that this is a story that's very, very old, tens of thousands of years old. So we have to think about that. Now, human migrations, that's a pretty easy term to understand. We're going to be talking about the migration of humanity to North and South America. Now, as that what I just told you implies, it means that people have not always been in these lands of North and South America, that people migrated here from somewhere else. I want to speak about that just a little bit. For one, this is something that scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists, the groups who look at this specific topic, this is something that they have only appreciated for really the last century or so, maybe even a little bit less. For a long time, it was thought that perhaps humanity evolved on the various continents independent of one another. We now know that that's not true. We know it's not true because of the work of anthropologists and archaeologists and paleologists, right? We know this because of the work of genetic researchers, of people who study DNA. But I want you to appreciate that it's scientific advancement that has made that understanding possible. In the 19th century, there was a strong belief that humans evolved in all various different places. There was an understanding that there was a migration to North and South America, that maybe humans just evolved in different places, right? Second thing I want to tell you about this story, though, is it is a story. The story I'm going to tell you is the story that the scientific disciplines have generated for us, who've allowed us to understand. It is not necessarily a story accepted by the indigenous peoples who continue to live in the lands of North and South America, including the Pacific Northwest, which is the focal point of this class. So I just want to reiterate, the story I'm about to tell you is a story rooted in archaeology and anthropology and other sciences, and I'll explain all the evidence to you. But it is not a story that spiritually is subscribed to by many of the indigenous peoples who live in the lands of the Pacific Northwest, and more broadly speaking, in North and South America. For them, they are from this particular soil, that they were born out of this soil, and this soil nurtured them, sustained them, and gave their peoples home, and is the cultural ferment of their people. And they believe that very, very, very firmly. Now, this is not to broadly say that all indigenous peoples that we collectively think of as Native Americans or American Indians, and we'll talk about those terms in subsequent lectures. This is not a necessarily an idea that the vast majority of them subscribe to, but I also don't want to blanket and say, that it refers to all of them, because there's plenty of indigenous peoples who do understand this scientific story and subscribe to it. But there are many whom understand the story, but they still believe in their spiritual traditions that say they came from this land, that there was no migration. And I want to respect that. I want to honor that understanding, even as we're trying to explore what the evidence, the archaeological evidence, the DNA evidence, the linguistic evidence, all of which we'll talk about in this particular lecture, what it suggests. So, prehistoric human migrations, the story in the ancient past of humans migrating to the continents of North and South America. Migrating from where? Well, from as you will see, originally from Africa, but more broadly speaking from what we term the Old World. And so we need to kind of get these terms here. You're going to hear them a lot in a class like this. You'll hear them a lot in history classes. You'll hear them a lot when you sort of listen to lectures by experts, or you read books by experts on that deal with issues between North and South America, and then the other continents like Europe and Africa and Asia, so on and so forth. You have to understand, and we'll explore this later in this class, when European explorers ended up arriving in North and South America, they were two continents. They were lands that were unknown to them. They may not have understood places in Asia or Africa accurately, but these European explorers at least understood that those places existed, even if they didn't have a particularly accurate view of those lands and those peoples and those cultures. They knew of them, roughly speaking. But when Columbus and the rest sailed west and arrived in North and South America, it was lands that they were unprepared for, lands that were hitherto unknown. And so European explorers began to refer to these lands as the New World because it was new to them. The land itself wasn't new. Geologically speaking, the land is as old as anywhere else in the world. And the peoples who were there had been on these lands for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, occupying these lands for as long as peoples in Europe or the Middle East or Africa or Asia had occupied their lands. But that term New World stuck. And that's why, so I use that term, but I also like to put it in parentheses. You'll see here, quote unquote, New World, because it was new to Europeans. And as such, we fall into the habit of continuing to use these terms. But I also want you to understand that there's a little bit of a cultural Eurocentric view embedded in the term, and there's a bit of a pejorative embedded in the term. So even though I'll be using it, I want you to understand that it's just out of sort of historic tradition and ease of use that I'm using the term New World to refer to North and South America. And when I use the term Old World, I'm referring to Europe and Asia and Africa. I don't want you to think in any way, shape, or form that I'm making some sort of value statement. I'm just using the terms as we have collectively used them. Okay? So, we've got some terminology figured out here. Prehistoric human migrations is ancient story of how humans arrived in North and South America. So, now that we understand that, let's start filling out this story a little bit. The first thing we need to do is work through the evidence. What is the evidence for how scholars have created this story? One of the things you're going to find when you take a college level history class is that we're very interested in you not just understanding what happened, not just understanding the complexity and the nuance of what happened. We want you to also understand the evidence for how we got here. Because evidence can be interpreted in different ways. And among scholars, evidence is very often interpreted in different ways. There's not always scholarly agreement on what the evidence means and what the evidence tells us. And I will often let you know in this class when scholars do disagree on the evidence. But it's important that you understand the evidence. I want you to understand the process by which history is created. And understanding the evidence and what the evidence can tell us and what the evidence can't tell us is crucially and critically important. So, as I already mentioned, prehistory refers to reconstructing the past without writing. And that means that we're going to be reliant a lot on anthropological and archaeological sources. So we need to understand those terms. So anthropology is a term that just means the study of man. That's all anthropology is, the study of man. Now, anthropology is an important and fascinating discipline. It's an important and fascinating discipline with many different sub-disciplines. There's many different areas of anthropology, if you will. The area of anthropology we'll be talking about in this particular lecture is what we call physical anthropology. And what physical anthropology is roughly speaking the study of humanity through bones and skeletal remains. Sometimes this is also called biological anthropology. So physical and biological anthropology will be really important to this story. The study of bones, and when you study the bones, A, what do the bones tell you? And B, what are the age of the bones? Because the age will tell you something very important. When did this individual live? And then the bones themselves can tell you things about their diet, their medical history, gender sometimes, or, excuse me, not gender, but sex, right? Biological sex. Although that's more complicated to determine than we used to think. And so we're not as certain about that. It can also tell you some cultural things as well. It can also tell you the age of the individual when they died. So whether this individual died at as a child or as an adolescent, a teenager, or an adult, or an elderly adult. So the bones can tell us lots of really important things. The more complete the skeletal remains, the more information we can learn. But even the tiniest bone fragments can contain information that a biological or physical anthropologist can learn much from. The other discipline that's very important here, and it's a discipline that's often related to both anthropology and history, which is archaeology. Archaeology is the study of the human past through the artifacts that humans create, right? An artifact is just a compound word derived from a Latin word that means like art or craft, and that's the art part, ars artis in Latin. And then, a fact it comes from the Latin word factum, something that's made or done. So an artifact is just anything that's created, anything that's made by humans. And humans are very, very interesting because we are not necessarily unique in this, but we are unique in the level that we do what I'm about to mention, which is that humans are noted for the way in which we manipulate our environment. Humans have always manipulated their environment to their benefit. They create shelters, they create tools, they manipulate landscapes, they manipulate animals and plants. And all of that becomes an artifact that is discoverable by archaeologists, can be dated by archaeologists, and then can be, and then can be studied for intent and function of what happened. So a lot can be learned from these things, even though they're not written. A couple of things about this. The first thing you need to know is artifacts and bones can both be dated. Some of this can be done through what's called radiocarbon dating, which is a process by which you look at carbon-14. And carbon-14 is found in organic material, and it has what's called a half-life. So it decreases by half every roughly 5,000 years. It's not quite like that, but that's basically what it is. And so we know how much carbon-14 there should be at the start, and then if we count how much is left, add up the years, and that gives us a rough date of something. Now, you get old enough and you're beyond radiocarbon dating. There are other ways you can date as well. There's dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. So if you make anything out of wood, you can look at the tree rings in the wood. There is, using what's called in situ or in site dating, which is that we have a better understanding of the geologic past now. It's when archaeologists do digs, right? An archaeologist does an excavation. Artifacts can be found on the surface, but more often than not, artifacts are found by digging down in the earth. And when you dig down in layers, you're going through geologic events, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, various phases like an ice age. And since geologists have dated these events with their own techniques and then identified these layers, what archaeologists can do is just dig down. When they find something in a particular era or area of the ground in a soil profile, they can then say, this happened during the great floods or during this eruption of this volcano, and so on and so forth. And that's a way they can date. So in dating these artifacts, not necessarily precisely to the exact year, but in dating these artifacts to relative eras, it gives us a sense of when something was created. And in doing so, right, you can then piece together a story of a past without writing. So that is a brief primer on archaeology and anthropology. Now let me talk about the limits of these things, because there are real limitations to this material. Bones can tell us a lot, but there's a lot that bones can't tell us. Bones, depending on what bones they are, how intact the skeleton is, can maybe give us some indication of culture, particularly if they were buried in a particular way. Maybe bones tell us about burial practices, and then with burial practices, we might be able to, glean some evidence into religious and spiritual beliefs. We might be able to tell things about the lifestyle of a person based on their injuries, and based on the stresses and stuff that we see in their bones from their life. But bones can never tell us the totality of a person's existence, of how they understood themselves, how they understood their relationship to the world, their relationship to other humans. It can't tell us how they understood their relationship to family in most cases. Similarly, artifacts can tell us a lot. They can tell us what people ate based on the tools and weapons that they used and needed. They can tell us what people wore based on the tools that they used to create clothing, or at least they can give us indications of that. Objects might tell us things that had special meaning, and thus give us some insight into culture and religion and spirituality. But please understand that artifacts can't tell us exactly everything we would want to know about the peoples and the cultures and the societies that created them. They give us limited insights. So there's a limit to what we can say. There's a limit to what we can know. And I think it's important to keep those things in mind, because as much as we now know about the prehistoric past that we had no fathom of, no inkling of before the development of these disciplines and before the development of new and exciting scientific technologies, there's also limitations to what we can know. And that's very important for you to understand and be aware of. So, let's talk about human history. Let's frame it very briefly before we begin to explore this migratory story. So, humans, as we think of humans today, are Homo sapiens. Now, there are actually levels of Homo sapiens. We're actually Homo sapiens sapiens, but we usually just call them modern Homo sapiens. The human beings that we have today on this planet reach their final evolutionary phase. I know for some of you out there, the idea of evolution might conflict with your personal religious or spiritual beliefs. I have no desire to change or alter those religious or spiritual beliefs, but in this class, I do expect you to understand the story, even if it's not something that you are personally willing to accept. So that caveat out of the way, modern Homo sapiens, right, the final evolutionary path of Homo sapiens, right, science tells us appeared about 200,000 years ago in Africa. That's where they arrived, right? They were in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, so below the Saharan desert, although the Saharan desert wasn't really there. Nonetheless, right, below what we think of today as the Saharan desert in sort of southern and central Africa, that's where, southern, central, and eastern Africa, that's where it appears that modern humans, modern Homo sapiens, reached their final stage of evolution 200,000 years ago. About 100,000 years ago, they began to leave Africa and began to move to all parts of the quote-unquote old world of Africa, Asia, and Europe. So they moved beyond their East African, Southern African, Central African home. They moved to parts of North Africa, into the Near East, into Asia, and into Europe. The question is, why? Why did they do that? And when and how did they arrive in the quote-unquote New World? Okay? Let's talk about the why they left. The why of why they left this area in Africa. Short answer is we don't know. And we may never know. We do have some insight into the mechanism by which they left. And what I mean by that is that we know that the climate was changing and that the climatic factors, essentially what had happened is we'd entered an ice age period, and that had changed the climate in a way that did two things. One, it altered the ecology of what is the Saharan desert area today. It was actually a well-watered sort of savanna grassland. We know that because if you go to mountainous areas in the middle of Sahara today, you'll find cave paintings. Now in those cave paintings, you'll see animals that are associated with grasslands and marshlands. And when you see that and you date those paintings, and they date to the prehistoric past, you're kind of left with two conclusions. One conclusion is humans from southern Africa set off into the middle of a desert and were trying to reach mountains that they didn't know exist to paint animals that were back on the lands that they had just left to this desert trek from. That's kind of nonsensical. The more likely explanation is the second one, which is humans were kind of occupying this cave or living around this cave or near this cave, and they were painting the animals they could just see down on the lands below, this sort of mountainside or hillside, right? Because the land itself was this fertile, verdant grassland with well watered, and all these animals existed, and we know that that's exactly what happened. So the climate had made what today we think of as a barrier, the Saharan desert, no longer a barrier. It wasn't a barrier. It was actually a great place to live for humans who were hunter-gatherers. They hunted and gathered their food. The other thing that happened is because so much water was consumed in Arctic and Antarctic glaciers, the ocean and sea levels dropped. And that created land bridges or shallow waters that allowed people to walk and branch out from Africa and explore new lands. So that's kind of the how of why around this time, around 100,000 years ago, it happened. But then the question was, well, if we know that, when and how did they arrive in North and South America? First, I want to tell you about the old theory, because this was the first theory that humans came up to explain this development, how they got to North and South America. And by the way, you might be wondering, well, when did we start to understand all of this? We began to piece it together. Some of this is late as the 19th century, but really between the late 19th century, but by the 1960s is where we really understood this. The final piece, in case you're wondering, had to do with geology and climate history. The discipline of geology has made leaps and bounds over the last 60, 70, 80 years. And so we understand the geologic past much better, including our climate cycles. Well, our natural climate cycles, not human-made climate change, but just natural climate cycles. And so we understood like ice ages and warming periods and all of those things. And then we understood their impact on landforms and continents across the globe. So that was kind of the final piece, is understanding that geology. That helped the archaeologists and anthropologists who studied this really piece together some of the disparate information that they were finding in the bones and the artifacts, and in the location that those things were found. So, with the help of breakthroughs in geology, the story came together. By the 1960s, it was well understood that humans evolved in what we think of as now sub-Saharan Africa. It was also well understood that about 100,000 years ago, humans migrated to the rest of Asia and Europe. It was also understood that they began to develop distinct prehistoric hunter-gatherer cultures and civilizations. It was also understood that around 10,000 years ago, there was strong evidence of human habitation, of hunter-gatherer culture in North and South America. This culture we'll talk about in the next lecture. It was called Clovis culture. Clovis, Clovis. We'll talk about it in the next lecture. I'm not going to talk about it right now. But there was this Clovis culture that was a hunter-gatherer culture. There was strong evidence for it 10,000 years ago. So it was understood that somehow between 100,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, somewhere in that like roughly 90,000 years, humans had migrated from the quote-unquote old world to the new world. The question was, when did they do it? How did they do it? It seemed like geology had provided the answer. And that answer then became the old theory of migration. Archaeologists knew that there was a hunter-gatherer culture living in Central Asia. And that culture looked very similar to the Clovis culture that emerged in North America. Archaeologists discovered that at the height of the last ice age, between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, the ocean levels dropped so much that a land bridge emerged between Siberia in Russia and Alaska. So let me say that again. A land bridge emerged between Siberia and Alaska. The land bridge is still there today. It's just underwater because the ocean levels are higher. This land bridge connected the quote-unquote old world and the new world by land. Siberia and Alaska were connected. This land bridge is called Beringia or Beringia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I've heard both. And it connected right across what we know today as the Bering Strait. You can see the Bering Strait on the map between Alaska and Siberia. There's a land bridge that connected them. And that land bridge connected them because ocean levels had dropped so low because of all the ice in the glaciers. And it emerged between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. And that seemed to solve the problem of migration for the scholars. You had a hunter-gatherer culture in Central Asia, and they simply followed game across the land bridge when it was available 15 to 10,000 years ago. And then the last ice age ended roughly 10,000 years ago. And when it ended, the glaciers receded by melting, and that water, the ice in the glaciers melted, became water, and the sea levels rose, and thus the land bridge was submerged. And so migration was kind of a one-phase thing. You had a phase between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago in which, people could cross, then the water levels rose, people couldn't cross anymore, and that was it. We solved the problem. And that was the theory. And it was a theory that was taught over and over again. If we ever meet face to face, you'll probably think that I'm ancient, but I'm really not that old. And I can remember being taught this in a high school anthropology class. I can even remember being taught this in college as the likely theory of migration. But the fact that I call it the old theory of migration should tell you that we have challenged it today. We have refined it, tweaked it, and in some ways overturned it. So let's talk about that. Challenging the old theory. There are several discoveries that have happened in the last 40 years that have slowly but surely challenged the old theory of migration. The first two are on this slide, the DNA evidence and something called Kennewick Man. And some of you listening to this lecture right now might say, does he mean like Kennewick, Washington, like in the Tri-Cities? I certainly do. But let's talk about the DNA evidence first. We've known about DNA, right, since the 1950s, and Watson and Crick, these British scientists who are responsible for discovering this. So we've known about DNA for a long time. But what has rapidly developed is not just our understanding of DNA, but our documentation of it, like through the human genome process, and our ability to process it. And scientists have been collecting genetic information from populations around the world to better understand humanity, mostly for medical reasons. But it's also of interest to people who study human evolution. And very quickly it became clear that it could also be of interest to archaeologists and historians. Let me tell you why. Because through the study of the human genetic history, of the human genome, if you will, as it's called, we began to learn that all sorts of, like embedded in human DNA is the entire history of not just individuals, but of entire populations. That their entire genetic history, including possibly migrations and splits, was embedded in their DNA. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of this, mostly because I'm not a scientist, and I don't know that I could provide a full, scientifically accurate explanation of this. But suffice to say, when the peoples of North and South America were genetically surveyed, the general expectation was that you would find a lot of genetic similarities, because ultimately these people came from one Central Asian gene pool. Remember, the old theory says that there was a group of hunter-gatherers in Central Asia who migrated across the land bridge, and then they were stuck. And therefore, when you look at the genetic history of these people, you should only find roughly Central Asian markers. Now, certainly they found a lot of Central Asian genetic markers in the peoples of North and South America, without question. But they also found markers from South Asia, like the types of markers you find in the people of India and Burma, Nepal, and Pakistan today. They also found markers of Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, etc. They also found East Asian markers, right? Places like China, Korea, Japan. They also found some Polynesian markers. So the Polynesian islands being, islands in the Pacific. The genetics were much more diverse than what was expected according to the old theory explanation of migration. So the genetics themselves was suggesting, right, a very diverse population mix that was here, suggesting that migration was more complicated than we originally thought. So genetics was saying this land bridge theory may not... genetics was not saying the land bridge itself wasn't the vehicle by which people came over, but it was saying that there might have been more people that came across, however it was they came across. And Kennewick Man seem to confirm this. So on the first slide of this, you saw a black table with bones laid out. That was actually Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man was a body found on the Columbia River in the 1990s. So down in the Tri-Cities, they have hydroplane races on the Columbia. And what happened was, they're a big event and people go to attend to watch them. Well, in the 1990s, a group of people hiked, I'm not sure it was legal or not, but they hiked onto federal land to get a better, less crowded view of the hydro races. The river happened to be particularly low during this time. And while they were over there, with the river low, they saw the remnants of bones. Actually, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, they saw the skull first, and they discovered that there were some bones there. And they decided that they had to report it to the local sheriff's department because they thought it might be a missing person or even a homicide. So the coroner's office was called out, and the coroner's like, well, clearly the body of a human, but this human didn't live any time in the last century. So the coroner knew right away that what they had found was something that was scientifically valuable. So they called out archaeologists and anthropologists from Washington State University to come take a look at it. And they became very, very excited because what they had found was a complete skeleton of a prehistoric human being dating probably between 8,000 and 11,000 years ago. So a significantly old skeleton. Now, before any real archaeological work could be done on an archaeological study of this skeleton, which then became dubbed Kennewick Man because of its location, could be done, one of the things that happened is they got caught in a legal battle between academics and scholars who wanted to study the body and local Native American tribes. There are various laws that we'll talk about later in this class that exist to protect Native American burials and Native American artifacts. And these laws are important, and these laws are necessary because throughout history, Native peoples, indigenous peoples, have had their graves and burials and artifacts desecrated and pillaged and stolen, sometimes in the name of science, but sometimes simply for profit. People wanting to steal native things and then sell them on the black market. And there was no law against this until, Native people started raising this issue in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even to this day, we've had laws passed to protect and respect these objects. But the flip side of this is sometimes the law can't handle nuance. And what happened is that Native people sued, saying that Kennewick Man was their ancestor and that he deserved a proper burial. And this got caught up in the courts and limited the study of Kennewick Man. And this case went on for years, even decades. Meanwhile, to avoid any future conflict with Native peoples, the federal government kind of bulldozed the site where Kennewick Man was found. Now, the federal government said it was part of routine, I think it was called, riverbank maintenance and various infrastructure projects that they had to do it. But archaeologists and scholars have long suspected it was to prevent any further fines, creating lawsuits to make the federal government's lives easier, to avoid future legal action by the tribes over this issue. The reason I raise this is there are some scholars who study Kennewick Man who feel very strongly that this body didn't just die in situ. He didn't just die there or was left there, but instead that he was ritualistically interned there, that this was a ritualistic burial site, if you will, and that there were more bodies there. And ritualistic burial sites are some of the most important archaeological finds for helping archaeologists reconstruct the past, because how we bury bodies often gives enormous indication to spiritual beliefs, cultural beliefs, and the material culture, and simply the lifestyle of the people who buried the bodies. There's a lot you can learn from grave sites. It's no coincidence that so much of archaeology revolves around finding the tombs of things, the burials of things, because historically humans have invested great effort into this. So many archaeologists think that we missed the opportunity to learn something really important by the sort of like bulldozing and sort of complete sort of restructuring of this area. Nevertheless, even though this got caught up in lawsuits and the study of Kennewick Man was limited, and ultimately the court sided with the tribes, there was some study of Kennewick Man. And what it was revealed in the limited study is that Kennewick Man's closest contemporary ancestor were the Ainu. Now, you might not know who the Ainu are, A-I-N-U, but they are the indigenous people of Japan. Many of you might not know that the people we think of today as the Japanese migrated in the ancient past to the islands of Japan, and there were indigenous peoples who were already there, who were sort of pushed to the northern island of Hokkaido, where they still live today, but whose culture and civilization is actually historically different than the rest of Japan, and they faced real discrimination and hardship from the Japanese people. But Kennewick Man's closest ancestor are the Ainu. That doesn't mean that Kennewick Man himself are Ainu. It just means that Ainu and Kennewick Man share common ancestors. And that common ancestor may not be the central migration theory that the old theory seems to stipulate. So, findings over the last 40 years have been changing things. Archaeology has also been challenging the old theory, because archaeologists working in places like Monteverde, Monteverde in Chile, South America, or in Topper, South Carolina, have been finding human artifacts and signs of human habitation that might go back as far as 50,000 years ago. In the case of Monteverde in Chile, they think 35 to 33,000 years ago. In the case of Topper, South Carolina, maybe as late as 50,000 years ago. And there's actually other sites that have cropped up in the last 20 years. The point of these is these sites all predate the land bridge. Remember, the land bridge doesn't show up until 15,000 years ago. If you have a site that dates to 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, what it means is that humans could not have used the land bridge to get to the Americas. They could not have used the land bridge because the land bridge doesn't show up till 15,000 years, which means they had to have another method or mechanism for getting into the Americas. And if you have evidence of humans in places like South America that date to 35 to 33,000 years ago, it means likely they were in North America earlier, because even if the land bridge didn't exist back at this time, the general consensus is the easiest crossing point would have been right from what is now Russia to Alaska. The distance there is 20 plus miles. It's the shortest distance and the likeliest source of point of coming across, even if they didn't use the land bridge, which means they were in the Americas earlier. Or, excuse me, it means they were in North America a little bit earlier. Now, it is important and fair and significant to acknowledge that many archaeologists challenge the dating of these sites. Also, they challenge the artifacts themselves. And let me just explain a little bit what I mean by that. It's very important to understand that when we're talking about prehistoric artifacts, especially in the Americas, the earliest artifacts are often very difficult to recognize and determine. These were people whose tools were made of bone and stone. And the bone tools, made of the bones of animals, often are so delicate and fragile they don't last. And if they do last, they're degraded in a way that makes it difficult to tell whether it's just a natural bone or something that someone has shaped into a tool. The other thing to be aware of is that they're shaping stones. They're shaping stones by like hammering them together to create like blade edges for knives, or to carve out spear points, or to make other kinds of tools that were useful to them. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell the difference between a natural stone or a heavily eroded stone and one that ancient humans created. And in some places, it's very difficult to date. I don't want to get too much into the weeds in this. Some of you sitting here listening to this, if you've made it this far, are saying, well, we've been in the weeds all this whole time. Why not go further? But as much as you think I've gone into a lot of detail, I'm just scratching the surface here. So archaeology is a very well-developed science, but dating can be difficult. The easiest kind of archaeology to date, and you can kind of see this in these images I have here, you can see the kinds of layers that are created when they dig, and you can see in the soil there the profiles. And as I mentioned earlier, right, if you get deeper into these, like to the edges there, and you can see the soil profiles, you would see like lines, and each line representing a different geologic era or event. It's always easier to do archaeology in the desert, primarily because in the desert with very little rainfall or precipitation, the clean lines for the geology to date something are usually remain. When you get into wetter environments like Topper, South Carolina, what happens is that there's groundwater, right? Water in the ground. And water in the ground sort of like ebbs and flows, but that's called the water table, and the water table refers to like how far below the surface groundwater is. As water accumulates, sometimes in wet environments it accumulates so much that the ground can't absorb it, and the water table just floods upwards and is actually above ground. Well, when that happens, that screws up the soil profile. It moves the layers up and down, thus making it harder to date when something occurred. And so many archaeologists have challenged the dating on this, saying they don't doubt that there's human artifacts, but they doubt the dating of it because of difficulties in the geology. That used to be the majority view. I would say now, as of the recording of this lecture, right in the 2020s, it's probably a minority view now. It's looking very much like this story is that the archaeologists who did the original dating of these things are probably closer to being right. Now, in some cases, the archaeologists have said, you haven't found a human artifact. You've simply found, like, some tools. You haven't found evidence of human campfire. You just found evidence of a natural fire with lightning strike. So, like, there's still archaeologists challenging the nature of these artifacts, but I would say that's become a minority view as well. It's looking very much like the date of human migration predates the time frame made possible by the land bridge as posited by the old theory. The other thing you need to be aware of is language. We have a much better idea of language now than we ever used to. So, I'm a language nut. I know numerous languages. And so I like this kind of stuff. So I'm going to be even nerdier than you're probably already assuming I am based on the start of this lecture. So I'm going to nerd out a little bit on this for you, okay? So we now know that languages are rarely what we call language isolates. Rarely is a language like on its own. In general, languages belong to language families. And every language family in general belongs to a broader family of languages. And what we mean by that is languages have relationships to one another. Some of you might even be familiar with this, right? Like, for instance, Italian and French and Portuguese and Romanian and Spanish and a couple others are all part of what are called the Romance languages, meaning that each of these languages is related to one another because they're all derived from Latin. And Latin itself is part of what's called the Italic family of languages, and Latin is related to other ancient languages that were found in Italy. And the Italic language family itself is part of a broader group of languages that we call the Indo-European languages, because they describe languages from Europe all the way to northern India. Now, not every language in that geographic area is what we call an Indo-European language, but a lot of them are. Almost all the languages of Europe are Indo-European. There are a handful there aren't. But there are also languages in India and in the Near East that are Indo-European languages. What that means is, in the very, very ancient prehistory, these people all spoke one language that scholars call Proto-Indo-European. And then as people migrated outward, they began to their languages began to change, but they still contained with them some of the characteristics and vocabulary of the mother language. And that's why these languages are all related to one another. And that's why, if you learn Spanish, you'll see a lot of similarities in Portuguese and French and Italian. If you learn German, you'll see a lot of similarities to Dutch and even English, because those are all Germanic languages, but they're all part of the Indo-European language family. This is true throughout the globe. And because we understand the relationships between languages now, we have a rough estimate for how long it takes languages to separate from one another. In other words, how long it takes for languages to become completely separate. Languages that start out the same to then become two languages or three languages. We know the time frame that happens, and it takes a very long time. I just want to give you an example that you might be familiar with. I'm speaking English with you right now. English arrived in North America because of settlers from England. That event happened over 400 years ago. And yet, if you were to get on a plane and go to London, you could still communicate with people in London. Certainly their accents are differently. Certainly they might use terms and phrases that you're not familiar with, right? Like if you ask, am I in London? And someone says, you're right, Bob's your uncle. You might look at them and say like, no, my uncle's not Bob. It's so-and-so. And you don't realize you're getting like a little phrase that means, yep, you're absolutely right. But still, you can figure it out. We can understand one another. And that's 400 years. Now, in a few more centuries, it's entirely possible that English in Britain might separate so much from English in, say, the United States and North America that they become mutually unintelligible, that we can't understand one another. But just think about it. It takes 400 years and we're still speaking the same language. Maybe a slightly different dialect, but the same language. We know how long this takes. The linguistic diversity in North and South America is so great that scholars say it roughly would have taken 35,000 years to achieve. So, what does this mean as we're coming to the conclusion of this? We can't say for certain exactly the story of human migration in North and South America. But what we can say is it's ancient and it is older and more ancient than described by the old theory. It clearly dates to 30,000 years ago, maybe as far back as 50, maybe even earlier. Which means they couldn't all come by the land bridge. Now some of you might say, well, how did they come? Well, we don't know for sure, but they could have easily built small little rafts made of wood or reeds to get across. If you say, no, that's impossible, we know that humans did that even earlier than this to Australia. It's about 80 miles gap between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Yet no one doubts that Aboriginal peoples are descended from settlers in Australia, and they would have had to arrive by raft or some sort of reed craft to get there. So we know that peoples around the globe had done this before. It was doable. And from there, they either migrated by land or, sort of like kept along the coast to reach other places. We'll likely never find evidence of this habitation because of the ice ages and the floods and the change in sea level. It is very unlikely we'll find evidence of this actual migration because of the way that the landscape has changed and the various geological events that have happened. But nonetheless, that doesn't make it less likely. And the archaeological sites in North and South America and the DNA evidence and the linguistic evidence all suggest it's an earlier, more diverse, more complex migration than we ever appreciated before. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.